You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is a robot with countless irrelevant menu options. Which is why with USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable, all at the touch of a button. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
Summer's here, and you can now get almost anything you need for your sunny days delivered with Uber Eats. What do we mean by almost? Well, you can't get a well-groomed lawn delivered, but you can get a chicken parmesan delivered. A cabana? That's a no. But a banana? That's a yes. A nice tan? Sorry, nope. But a box fan? Happily, yes. A day of sunshine? No. A box of fine wines? Yes. Uber Eats can definitely get you that. Get almost anything delivered with Uber Eats. Order now. Alcohol in select markets. Product availability may vary by region. See app for details.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 217, The Battle About Britain, part 1, What Are We Doing Next? This week, a big thank you goes out to Gareth for choosing to support the podcast by becoming a member. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. The Battle of Britain was caused by the German plans for an invasion. Their goal was to send a force across the English Channel that was strong enough to force a British surrender. It would have been the largest amphibious assault in history up to that time, and in some versions of the plan, it would have been bigger than the invasion of Normandy. But it would never happen. Operation Sealion was an impossible dream, not a realistic or rational plan, and as the weeks ticked by in the autumn of 1940, the Wehrmacht would also prove itself unable to meet even the prerequisites of that operation. Even though it would never occur, understanding the Battle of Britain and the actions of the Luftwaffe, which would make up most of the events of the Battle of Britain, well, you have to start with an understanding of what the Germans were trying to achieve and why aerial superiority was seen as so critical to the success of the operation. This episode will examine the early discussions among the German military and political leaders as they began to investigate the idea of dealing with Britain directly. During these conversations, there were known requirements for an invasion, even if the exact size and structure of that invasion had not been decided, and most of those requirements revolved around the actions of the Luftwaffe. Up to the point that the Luftwaffe began to investigate attacking Britain directly, it was at a time on an incredible streak of successes, dating back to the invasion of Poland. From September 1st, 1939, all the way until June 1940, the Luftwaffe had accomplished every major task put in front of it, and in most cases it had dominated the skies over the battlefield. This run of successes was certainly never a bad thing in and of itself, but it did present some issues for the Luftwaffe as they prepared for their next task. The first problem was that many German leaders, from Hitler on down, believed that the Luftwaffe was much more capable than it was. This view was supported by the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, who was always willing to suggest that the Luftwaffe could do just about anything. In the defense of the German leaders, the string of successes had not given them a good measuring stick for what was and was not within their capabilities. And even when they'd not done their jobs perfectly, for example with the airborne operations in Norway or over Dunkirk, the staggering successes of the other arms of the Wehrmacht had more than obfuscated any problems in the air. The second problem that the Luftwaffe had dated back to before the start of the war, and they'd kind of caused it themselves because of its reputation among other nations, which had greatly boosted the rearmament efforts of enemy air forces like the Royal Air Force. And while most of them had not had time to boost their strength to the point that they could resist German air attacks, the British had been able to call upon more resources than anyone, and they had more time. These issues combined with the fact that the Luftwaffe had been designed for a specific purpose, and in the battles over Britain, it was moving away from that specific purpose. Of all of the air forces of Europe, the Luftwaffe had, from its very beginnings, been the most closely associated with actions on the ground. It excelled at close air support missions, best exemplified by aircraft like the Stuka, and operational level missions against the logistic networks of their enemies. This included actions against targets like railways, roads, airfields, those type of things. These operations were always in close association with the German army, and this meant all it needed to do was to disrupt the enemy for a brief period of time while the army achieved its objectives. But over Britain, the situation would be very different. There would be no German ground attacks, and instead the Luftwaffe had to win the battle on its own merits and against a determined enemy that would not be displaced or discouraged by other military defeats. This required a shift to a strategic mindset, and it would lean heavily upon the strategic bombing capabilities of the German bomber force. It also meant that there would be a battle of attrition over Britain. While the Luftwaffe had a tremendous amount of experience after multiple wartime campaigns, they had almost no experience in this type of fighting. During the earlier campaigns, the time frames had been compressed, with a few days or a few weeks of operations required, and even then, it was always against a greatly overmatched enemy. The clashes against RAF Fighter Command would be different, because for the first time, the qualitative and quantitative metrics were far closer to even than they had ever been before, and the Luftwaffe planes would be further from home. There was another problem that would have to be solved as well, one that was less obvious. The intelligence organs of the Luftwaffe would also be called upon in more important ways than they had during the previous 9 months of the war. Military intelligence would be a critical part of successfully executing military campaigns during the Second World War. There would be many successes and failures on all sides, but the Battle of Britain would be the first time that the Luftwaffe's intelligence services would be so critical to overall success of an operation. The intelligence section of the Luftwaffe was led by Joseph Beppo Schmid. Schmid was one of the old guard of the Nazi supporters, having been with the party since before the Beer Hall Putsch back in 1923. Since that time, he'd worked closely with Goering and was rewarded with multiple promotions throughout the war and then later in the war years. Now this is perhaps the best summary of Schmidt's abilities and contributions, which comes from Norman Ridley in the book The Role of Intelligence in the Battle of Britain. Ridley would say of Schmidt that while he was promoted throughout the war, quote, "Having said that, there is no record of any historian claiming that he served with distinction in any of those roles." End quote. Schmidt was not some brilliant leader of an intelligence organization, and he'd not surrounded himself with brilliant intelligence officers. But there was one thing he truly excelled at. You see, Schmidt excelled at telling the Luftwaffe leadership, and therefore the rest of the Wehrmacht, exactly what the Luftwaffe leadership wanted to hear. Throughout the Battle of Britain in particular, the intelligence groups within the Reich Air Ministry, which were led by Schmidt, mostly just delivered whatever information Goering required to justify whatever decision he wanted to make. As you can imagine, this was not a great way to make the correct decisions. But it was not due to a lack of information, because the information group within the Air Ministry, which was dedicated to gathering radio traffic, had a pretty good picture of the state of the RAF. This group was led by Wolfgang Martini, and throughout the early parts of the war, they had pieced together a pretty good picture of how Fighter Command had structured its communications and what the British were experimenting with for radar. This picture became far more detailed after the fall of France due to the ability for German radio listening posts to be placed along the French coast, with a total of 24 eventually being placed along the English Channel for the purpose of intercepting as many radio signals of all types as possible. The problem was that Martini reported to Schmid, who ignored most of this very good and pertinent information. While these radio intercepts were one important source of information, there were other avenues to gain information about the current state of British resistance in society. There were many nations that were friendly with Germany but technically neutral in the war, which maintained teams in London, nations like Spain, Hungary, and Japan. Particularly in the case of Spain and Japan, the reports from their ambassadors in London were frequently just given to the German ambassadors in Madrid and Tokyo. The overall accuracy of these reports varied, but most of them were pretty good. In some cases, they misidentified facts on the ground, while in other cases, they reported the facts on the ground correctly, but then exaggerated the effects of some of the things that they pulled out of British society. Some of these reports would seem to confirm the German expectations, but they caused the Germans to believe that they were far more successful than they actually were in their war against Britain. There were a few reports that made it seem like the British were almost out of food, claiming that the population was already suffering from scurvy in some of the larger population centers due to a lack of vitamin C. These reports also claimed that many goods had already disappeared from shelves and even canned goods would be gone soon. The food situation in Britain was a topic of concern for the British government and for the British people, but it never came close to approaching as close to a disaster as maybe these reports made it seem. While it's easy to criticize some of these errors, it's also good to remember that gathering this type of economic and societal information during wartime would prove to be very challenging. The Allies would have just as many issues as the Germans would. Getting information about the fighting itself was equally challenging, because all of the fighting after June would occur either over the waters of the North Sea and the English Channel or over unfriendly territory. This meant that, unlike the British, the Germans were almost totally dependent on information gathered from pilots or airmen of what happened over enemy territory, and this was often quite inaccurate. The largest inaccuracy was caused by the overclaiming of kills by pilots during combat, which was particularly problematic during some of the larger aerial battles. The most common case of issues were when multiple pilots would attack the same enemy, particularly one that had already been damaged, and then they would all claim to have shot down or to have landed the decisive blow on the enemy. This would multiply the reported kills many times over, with documented cases of 9 German pilots claiming victories during the Battle of Britain on one single aircraft. On both sides of the conflict, intelligence groups would try and sort through these claims to find the most accurate number, but this was often difficult, especially when hopes and expectations came into conflict with actual facts, and it was always going to be so tempting to be optimistic about the numbers. The problem was, small optimistic guesses compounded over time. If you constantly overestimated by 1, after 35 aerial engagements, you're at a plus 35. The result would be that the German Luftwaffe would claim to have shot down more British aircraft than they thought existed at the start of the campaign. While gathering and interpreting information was one key aspect of winning the battle, another was putting in place a plan that gave the Luftwaffe and the invasion the best chance of success. Planning for operations against Britain had started during the pre-war years, with April 1st, 1939 being the date when the Luftwaffe Intelligence Group, again under Schmidt, began crafting 3 different intelligence assessments, which would be the basis for any future German operations. Study Blue would be the report that detailed the information that they had on Britain during this time. The assessment would run 94 pages and was created based on a lengthy series of meetings where a committee of German intelligence officers evaluated and discussed all of the information available. During these pre-war months, it was generally easier to get information about events in Britain, and the resulting assessment would actually be quite accurate. It would detail many items of importance around Britain's economy and their military preparedness for war. It also was not completely optimistic about the future. For example, the report would predict that RAF Fighter Command would probably match the Luftwaffe in terms of fighter numbers as early as 1941. But there was also an opportunity, because at least in 1939 and 1940, as the report claimed, the RAF would be far below the German air strength. While Study Blue was somewhat realistic and optimistic in the short term, there would be other Luftwaffe theorists and leaders from before the war that were far less optimistic about the Luftwaffe's chances in any kind of conflict against Britain. For example, in one of the many plans for a war against Britain that were done before 1940, there was one completed by Staff Officer Hans Geisler, and he would argue that if the Luftwaffe wanted to seriously impact the ability of Britain to wage war, then it would have to be a long and prolonged campaign. He estimated that it would take at least 2 years for such an operation to be successful, but that was a much longer time than the Germans were going to give the operations after the fall of France. They were looking at more like a 2-month time frame, not a 2-year time frame. And Geisler's expectations, or his estimations of fighter command strength and Luftwaffe strength, and how he advocated for this long war idea, was totally at odds with the other studies done by the Luftwaffe. You can't be in a long war of attrition with an enemy and hope to win if you think that by 1941, they're going to be outproducing you in aircraft, which is what many within the Luftwaffe believed.
Hey, it's Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast. The NBA playoffs are here, and Michelob Ultra is getting you closer to the game than ever with courtside seats and more. Enter now at michelobultra.com/courtside. Michelob Ultra Superior Access Courtside 2024 to 2025 sweepstakes. No purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents 21 or older. Ends on July 1st, 2025. Multiple entry periods. Visit michelobultra.com/superior access/courtside for free entry deadlines, and official rules. Message and data rates may apply. Void where prohibited.
Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for the stay.
Regardless of expectations before the war, once the war started and once France had fallen, the Luftwaffe turned its eyes to Britain. The start of the Luftwaffe campaign specifically against Britain can be set to June 30th, 1940, when Goering issued the, quote, general directive for the operation of the Luftwaffe against England. These orders were provided to 3 Luftflotten, or air fleets, the 2nd and 3rd, which were based in occupied France, and then Luftflotten 5, which was based in Norway. There were a few problems with this directive, but the one that would in retrospect have the largest impact was that it was not a very focused order. An important decision had to be made about how to focus the Luftwaffe's air strength, and it depended on whether the Germans felt that they were preparing for an air siege of the British Isles or they were preparing for an invasion. This decision was important because it would play a major role in dictating the types of targets that were selected and then how those targets would be attacked. In the case of a long siege, the best types of targets were those that would cause long-term problems for the British defense if they were lost. Things like population centers, port facilities, factories would all be good examples of these types of targets. On the other hand, if the plan was really just to prepare for an invasion that was going to happen a few months in the future, the key targets were those that would have an immediate impact on the ability of the British to resist an invasion, and this brought types of targets like airfields and naval ships and coastal fortifications far higher on the list of priorities. If they were preparing for an invasion, speedy attrition of the RAF fighter command to kind of whittle down their numbers would also be more impactful. But the directive released by Goering did not really focus on this decision and left the door open for both options. Instead, it took the far less bold approach of giving the orders for small-scale attacks to begin on British targets, particularly against the RAF, port facilities, and transportation infrastructure, without a really specific overall objective. Instead, Luftwaffe strength would be spread out in small-scale attacks designed just as much to probe and determine British defenses as they were to actually do real damage. In theory, Schmidt's intelligence branch would have been a good source of information on which targets to hit and which targets would have the greatest impact, but there was also some indecision in their lists as well. Schmidt's team provided a list of 50 targets, but without any clear guidance of their priority. This lack of focus was then compounded by the fact that each of the Luftflotten would be essentially managing their own campaign due to the fact that there was no Luftwaffe general staff. This meant that all actual operations were planned at the air fleet level and below, limiting the overall coordination between the different regions that the Luftflotten were responsible for. The problem of target selection was bad enough at the start of the campaign, and it would only deteriorate as the fighting developed. It was difficult enough to get information about what was happening in Britain before trying to determine the effectiveness of previous attacks, and that was a constant requirement as the campaign evolved. This resulted in some of the most famous decisions of the entire battle, and have resulted in some of the most popular what-ifs of the campaign. For example, after some initial attacks on the chain-home radar stations, when it appeared that results were disappointing, the Germans abandoned the attacks on those radar stations entirely. A greater focus on the early warning systems would have forced the RAF to drastically alter how it responded to German air attacks, and would have hampered their ability to concentrate large enough fighter groups on the incoming raids. The attacks on fighter command airfields during the early parts of the campaign would be another example here. They would eventually be tapered off in favor of other targets because it was believed that most of the strength of the RAF had already been destroyed due to faulty intelligence. The shift to attacks on industrial targets, including London, would in theory force Fighter Command to commit the last of its reserves. Unfortunately for the Germans, the Luftwaffe intelligence was incorrect, and what they did not know is that the airfield attacks were pushing Fighter Command to the brink, and in fact, switching targets gave them breathing space and let them recover. In all cases, though, the problem was a lack of focus, driven by a lack of focus from the heads of the Luftwaffe, but also a misunderstanding of the tasks in front of them. One of the great examples of how the Luftwaffe did not understand the task in front of them was around the strength of the RAF. During the summer of 1940, after the focus had shifted to Britain, there were still arguments happening at Luftwaffe High Command about how many operational fighters were even in the RAF. Goering believed the most optimistic number possible, which was only around 400 to 500 fighters. Others, like Theo Osterkamp, an ace in both World Wars, believed that they had more than that in just the airfields around London, and he believed the number was somewhere maybe north of 600. This number was critical because it was the way in which the progress of the campaign had to be judged. The orders from Hitler were to prepare for an invasion, and as a precondition to that invasion, RAF Fighter Command had to be, if not destroyed, so reduced in strength that it could not threaten German air superiority over the invasion convoys and the invasion beaches. This meant that a certain number of fighters had to be destroyed every week and every month of the campaign, particularly with the date of the invasion being set for September 1940. That left only a matter of weeks, and the numbers got really tough really fast. Even the relatively optimistic estimates for RAF fighters that the Luftwaffe chose to believe meant that the Luftwaffe had to average something like 100 fighters destroyed per week to account for the new fighters that would surely arrive from British factories over that time span. And they had to sustain that 100 fighters per week rate for around 2 months, which really could only happen if the RAF was stupid and did the stupidest possible things and just kept sending fighters up to be shot down day after day with no real change in tactics. It did not help that there were far fewer Luftwaffe fighters available than was expected. Due to attrition, maintenance, and other duties around Germany's newly conquered territories, the 3 Luftflotten that would be arranged against Britain would only have around 700 operational fighters between them. That was roughly on par with the reasonable number of expected British fighters. This meant that not only did the Luftwaffe fighters need to shoot down a huge number of British aircraft, they also had to do so while trading at a very favorable rate. There needed to be fighters to cover the invasion convoys from British bombers, even if every single Hurricane and Spitfire was a burning hulk on the British countryside. The numbers and the time frame meant that there was no real margin of error in the Luftwaffe's operations. They had to hit fast, and they had to keep hitting incredibly hard. They had to do it day after day, week after week, for over a month. Another problem that was layered on top of all of the other problems that we've already discussed was the fact that the Luftwaffe could not just immediately move into attacking Britain after the armistice was signed with France. There was the problem of determining the exact plan, which we've already discussed, but also the very real logistical problem of getting the Luftwaffe planes into the correct position to launch their attacks. Range was going to be a real problem for the German fighters, and the best way to ameliorate this problem was to try and build airfields as close to the coastline as possible. There were some French airfields that could be used, but nowhere close to enough of them, and so more had to be built and expanded. Along with the airfields, there was a concerted effort to move up ground crews and to build out logistics connections that would allow for a prolonged aerial campaign. This meant that while small attacks would be launched in June and July, this was really infrastructure month for the Luftwaffe, with one order stating, quote, "The intensified attacks against the enemy air force can be ordered very soon. Until then, careful preparations, maintenance, and improvements of personnel and material readiness for battle should continue." Once these operations were complete and more specific plans and operations were required, Goering would have more meetings with the leaders of the Luftflotten that were involved. The orders that resulted from these meetings would include orders like, quote, "As long as the enemy air force is not defeated, the prime requirement for the air war is to attack the enemy air force at every possible opportunity by day or by night, in the air or on the ground, without consideration of other tasks." End quote. That type of order was relatively straightforward, but actually introduced more problems and a greater spread of resources. The only way to defeat the RAF was to destroy it, but that would require not just shooting down planes, but preventing their replacement. That was not going to be easy, and in fact, the only way that was even possible was with a prolonged campaign of attrition, and the acceptance of higher losses than the Germans had suffered so far in the war. Now, this kind of war against an enemy air force, to destroy it by every opportunity, day or night, is something we don't have a lot of things to compare to. And really, the only comparison we have during the war would be the Allied bombing campaign over Germany in 43 and 44, and that was a long and bloody affair. The Germans simply did not have the aircraft to make such a campaign a reality. The commander of Luftwaffe II, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, would write at this time that, quote, "Although we might gain a temporary ascendancy in the air, permanent air superiority was impossible without the occupation of the island, for the simple reason that a considerable number of British air bases, aircraft, and engine factories were out of the range of our bombers." End quote. The German bomber range was a serious problem, and there was no way to fix that in the short term, and that's what mattered for the campaign in the middle of 1940. All they cared about were short-term results, not long-term results. July would be when things really started getting messy around the divergent goals of the Luftwaffe over Britain. As I mentioned earlier, there were clear priorities for where resources should be focused to prepare for an invasion: aircraft, airfields, immediate defenses, etc. However, orders began to be given to the Luftwaffe commanders to instead shift their focus on armament and industrial targets, which were more important for the long-term siege strategy. Both of the Luftwaffe based in France had already started attacking British shipping in the English Channel, which was not a bad idea at all, impacting immediate trade while also resulting in a growing number of aerial victories. But even this was mostly just done due to a lack of firm direction on what else they should be doing. These types of attacks, which we will discuss in further detail in episode 220, were operations that the Luftwaffe had prepared for, with two different Luftwaffe commands being equipped and trained specifically for a maritime strike role using HE-111s. Unfortunately, in June, many of those aircraft were still in northern Norway, having been based in that region to mount operations against Allied shipping that were being evacuated from Narvik during June. In a bit of an odd twist, the Channel War actions that the Luftwaffe would be doing in these early weeks of the battle were only retroactively approved by Göring, after he was informed of the orders that had already been given. And even at this early time, the Luftwaffe leadership would be presented with an important decision. How would the priority of ports and related facilities be counterbalanced against the priority of shipping? Spurl, the commander of Luftwaffe III, believed they should be the primary target, the port facilities and sort of related areas around them, while Göring and Kesselring disagreed, and they thought shipping should be the most important target. The conversations about the priority of the ports would also tie into the broader attacks on British trade that were being pursued by the German Navy. And trying to coordinate with the German Navy was a whole separate problem. To summarize this episode, in June and July 1940, the Luftwaffe had a goal of attacking Britain. But in terms of details, strategies, and overall goals, there simply was not enough clarity for concrete and cohesive operations to be planned. This lack of grounded planning would be on full display over Britain as the fighting ramped up over the course of August and September. But next episode, we're going to focus on the other side of the equation, on the British government and the RAF, and how they would prepare, at times frantically, for the coming German attacks.